You didn't plan to change. You just stopped forcing yourself to stay the same. That is where it began. Not with a bold decision, not with a public moment, not with clarity or courage. It began quietly, in places no one was watching. It began the first time you went home after a conversation and felt heavier than when you arrived. The first time laughter came out of your mouth but never reached the place inside you that used to respond. The first time you noticed that explaining yourself didn't make things better, it only made you more tired. You didn't mark that moment. You didn't name it. You didn't tell anyone, "This is changing me." You simply adjusted and moved on. That is how most changes begin. Not announced, not dramatic, just absorbed. You kept doing what you had always done because that was easier than asking why it was starting to hurt. You kept showing up in the same way because you had learned early that consistency kept things stable, even when it cost you something quietly. And slowly, without realizing it, you started giving less of yourself, not out of intention, but out of preservation. There was a time when you had endless words. You could explain your intentions. You could soften misunderstandings. You could sit in discomfort for the sake of harmony. You could stay longer than you should have because you believed that effort would eventually be met with understanding. But something shifted before you were ready to acknowledge it. Not because people changed, but because you noticed you were the only one doing the work to keep things afloat. You noticed that understanding had become a one-directional act. You noticed that being flexible had turned into being unprotected. And still, you did not leave. You did not confront. You did not set boundaries with confidence. You simply grew quieter. That quiet wasn't intentional. It was the result of too many moments where your honesty felt inconvenient. Too many times when your needs were framed as complications. Too many subtle signals that what you offered was expected, not valued. So you adapted. You started thinking before speaking, measuring your responses, editing your reactions, not out of fear, but out of experience. Experience taught you that explaining yourself rarely produced relief. It taught you that clarity didn't always lead to respect. Sometimes it only revealed how little space there was for you. There is a specific kind of tiredness that comes from always being understood on the surface but never fully received. A tiredness that doesn't come from conflict but from repetition. The repetition of giving more context. The repetition of justifying your tone. The repetition of clarifying what you meant when you already said it clearly the first time. That is when the change began. Not when you stopped caring, but when caring started requiring too much from you. You noticed that your presence began to feel transactional, that certain people listened only long enough to respond, not to understand, that your effort was expected to be endless while theirs remained conditional, and something in you registered that imbalance before your mind could explain it. You didn't become distant. You became selective. You didn't grow colder. You grew aware. Awareness doesn't arrive as wisdom. It arrives as discomfort, a mild resistance, a pause before responding, a hesitation where there used to be immediacy. You still showed up, but differently. You still cared, but you stopped overextending. You still participated, but you no longer made yourself smaller to fit spaces that refused to adjust. This was not rebellion. This was exhaustion, meeting honesty. You began noticing how often you were translating yourself for others, how often you softened language to avoid tension, how often you carried responsibility that was never explicitly assigned but quietly assumed. And one day, without ceremony, you stopped reaching as far. Not because you were done with people, but because you were done abandoning yourself to keep things comfortable. That change wasn't visible to others at first. It looked like normalcy, like maturity, like composure. But inside, something was reorganizing. Something was withdrawing from roles you no longer recognized as yours. You didn't mean to change like this, but the version of you that kept everything together couldn't survive the weight indefinitely. There is a point where effort stops being noble and starts becoming erasure, a point where understanding everyone leaves no space to understand yourself. You crossed that point quietly. You noticed that silence began to feel safer than explanation, that fewer words felt more accurate than long defenses, that withholding your response did not feel like loss, but relief. And in that relief, you realized something uncomfortable. You weren't changing for no reason. You were responding to years of accumulation. Accumulation of expectations you never agreed to. Accumulation of roles that were handed to you without consent. Accumulation of emotional labor that went unacknowledged. You didn't wake up and decide to be different. You simply stopped compensating for what others refused to notice. And that is where the discomfort began for those around you, because change is rarely threatening on its own. What unsettles people is when you change without explanation, when you no longer reassure, when you no longer offer context for choosing yourself differently. But this section of your life was never meant to be explained. It was meant to be lived quietly until it felt stable enough to stand on its own. You didn't mean to change like this. You meant to survive without disappearing. You meant to stay present without performing. You meant to exist without constant justification. This was not the beginning of distance. It was the beginning of alignment. And even if no one noticed right away, even if no one named it, even if you struggled to articulate it yourself, something true had begun. The version of you that continues from here will not be louder. It will be clearer. It will not demand attention. It will command respect through consistency. And this is the truth you may not have words for yet, but you feel it deeply. You are not becoming someone else. You are finally withdrawing effort from what never held you with care. That is where the change began. Staying the same never felt like a choice. It felt like responsibility. You learned early that consistency made things easier for others, that being reliable kept conflict away, that adjusting yourself slightly, again and again, was the simplest way to keep connections intact. So you stayed recognizable, you stayed available, you stayed agreeable enough to avoid friction, even when something inside you started to resist quietly. At first, the cost was small, barely noticeable. You ignored a thought. You swallowed a reaction. You delayed a boundary. And each time, you told yourself it didn't matter. You told yourself that understanding people was a strength, that being the one who listened made you valuable, that holding space was better than asking for it. But no one told you that staying the same requires energy. And no one warned you that when that energy is always directed outward, something inside you begins to thin. You became the listener people counted on. The one who didn't interrupt, the one who remembered details, the one who absorbed stories, frustrations, disappointments, explanations. You learned how to nod at the right moments, how to respond without escalating, how to reassure without committing. And slowly, without realizing it, you began curating yourself around that role. You filtered your words so conversations stayed smooth. You shaped your reactions so others felt safe. You adjusted your tone so no one felt challenged. And the more skilled you became at this, the more it was expected of you. That's how expectation works. It solidifies around what you tolerate. The conflict didn't arrive as a breakdown. It arrived as hesitation, a pause before answering, a sense that responding took more effort than before. A quiet calculation. Do I explain or do I let this pass? You started noticing that being heard required more work than it should. That clarity didn't lead to change, only to more requests for patience. That being understanding had turned into being endlessly accommodating. And the strangest part was this. People praised you for staying the same. They told you how grounded you were, how easy you were to talk to, how dependable, how mature. What they didn't see was how much restraint that praise relied on. You were becoming someone, but the version you were becoming no longer fit the role people appreciated. And that mismatch created tension, not externally, but internally. You felt it when conversations pulled you backward, when you sensed yourself shrinking just enough to stay acceptable, When you heard yourself agreeing before checking whether you actually did, that tension was the cost. You paid it in moments of quiet frustration you couldn't fully explain, in evenings where you felt empty without knowing why, in a growing distance between what you thought and what you said. Staying the same required you to ignore certain impulses, the impulse to speak plainly, the impulse to step back, the impulse to stop managing how others felt, and every ignored impulse left a residue. You began to recognize the difference between listening and disappearing, between being considerate and being erased. But naming that difference felt dangerous, because it threatened the balance you had worked so hard to maintain. So you compromised further. You stayed the same on the outside while something else formed underneath. A version of you that noticed patterns, remembered imbalances, and quietly took notes. A version that didn't argue, but didn't forget either. This is where the conflict deepened. The listener you were expected to be was passive, receptive, endlessly patient. The person you were becoming was more aware, less flexible, slower to respond. One version existed for smooth interactions. The other existed for personal survival. And you tried to be both. That duality was exhausting. You'd listen attentively while internally disagreeing. You'd reassure while feeling unconvinced. You'd participate while wanting distance. And afterward, you'd wonder why familiar interactions left you feeling unsettled rather than connected. Because staying the same meant denying the signals that told you something was off. It meant continuing conversations that asked too much from you. It meant fulfilling emotional roles without renegotiation. It meant remaining available even when availability cost you clarity. You weren't afraid of change. You were afraid of disruption. Disruption of relationships that depended on your consistency. Disruption of dynamics that benefited from your predictability. Disruption of the version of you others felt comfortable relying on. So you endured the tension quietly. But tension doesn't disappear when ignored. It just relocates. It settles into the body. It shows up in reluctance, in fatigue, in a growing awareness that staying the same was more draining than evolving. You realized that your silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was expensive. That every unspoken truth demanded energy to suppress. That every time you chose ease over honesty, you paid with internal strain. And still, you didn't explode. You didn't confront dramatically. You simply started calculating differently. You weighed the effort of explaining against the cost of staying silent. You weighed the risk of being misunderstood against the exhaustion of being endlessly understood incorrectly. And slowly, staying the same stopped feeling like stability and began to feel like stagnation. The listener you were expected to be asked you to prioritize harmony above authenticity. The person you were becoming couldn't sustain that imbalance. This was not a rejection of who you had been. It was a reckoning with what that role demanded. You weren't becoming selfish. You were becoming honest about capacity. You weren't withdrawing care. You were withdrawing from roles that required self-neglect. Staying the same had cost you spontaneity. It had cost you ease. It had cost you the simple relief of not monitoring yourself constantly. And the more aware you became of that cost, the harder it was to keep paying it. This is where the struggle sharpened, not because others demanded more, but because you could no longer ignore what staying the same was taking from you. You began sensing that continuity was no longer synonymous with integrity, that consistency without self-consideration was unsustainable. The listener role didn't collapse. You stepped out of it gradually, not with explanation, with restraint. Because you were beginning to understand something essential. Staying the same was no longer neutral. It was a decision, and it asked too much. The weight didn't announce itself. It never does. It settled quietly, accumulating in places no one looked, in pauses between responses, in the effort it took to stay composed, in the careful editing of your reactions before they ever reached the surface. You learned how to carry it without sound, without complaint, without acknowledgement. That's the thing about silent weight. It teaches you how to function while being overloaded. You carried expectations that were never spoken but always implied. Be understanding, be steady, be reasonable, be the one who doesn't make things harder. Those instructions weren't delivered directly. They were absorbed through repetition, through how people relaxed when you complied and tensed when you didn't. So you complied. You learned how to hold pressure without letting it show, how to nod when something didn't sit right, how to absorb tension so the room could remain calm. You told yourself this was maturity, that it was easier to manage yourself than to manage conflict. And for a while, it worked. People leaned into your reliability. They assumed your silence meant capacity. They mistook your composure for agreement. And the more you handled without protest, the more was placed on you responsibility, expectation, emotional labor. You became the stable one by default. But stability, when taken for granted, becomes a burden. You started feeling the strain in subtle ways, in how much preparation it took to enter conversations, in how drained you felt after interactions that once felt neutral, in the way your thoughts needed recovery time. You were carrying more than tasks or roles. You were carrying other people's comfort, their assumptions, their unspoken reliance on you, not disrupting the balance. And no one saw this because you didn't make it visible. You became skilled at emotional containment, at holding reactions back until they dissolved internally, at pausing just long enough to respond with what was expected rather than what was true. Containment became habit, then reflex. But containment is not the same as resilience. It requires constant vigilance, awareness of tone, monitoring of expression, suppression of impulses, and that vigilance cost energy consistently, quietly. You carried pressure without asking who had placed it there. Some of it came from roles you stepped into willingly. Others came from expectations you inherited without consent. The dependable one, the reasonable one, the one who doesn't overreact, the one who always understands. Each role carried weight, and you held them all simultaneously. What made it heavier was the absence of visibility. No one checked because you appeared capable. No one questioned because you didn't resist. No one asked if you could carry it because you already were. So the load increased. You learned to internalize strain instead of expressing it, to redirect discomfort inward so environments stayed smooth, to handle conflicting expectations by adjusting yourself rather than addressing the contradiction. That adjustment added up. It showed up as fatigue unrelated to effort, as reluctance without clear cause, as a quiet sense of being crowded inside your own head. You weren't overwhelmed by one thing, you were compressed by many, and because you carried it well, no one thought to relieve you. The silence became part of the problem. You didn't name what you were holding, partly because you didn't know how, and partly because naming it risked destabilizing the roles people had come to rely on. So you contained it instead. You rationalized. You minimized. You told yourself it was fine. But your body registered the truth before your words did. Tight shoulders, shallow breath, a delay before responding, a subtle resistance where there used to be ease. You were carrying expectations that required you to remain consistent even as you changed, to respond predictably even when circumstances shifted, to be accessible even when accessibility cost you. And the strangest part was that nobody was forcing this explicitly. The pressure persisted because you maintained it. You were carrying a version of yourself others recognized, even as it no longer fit you. And maintaining that version required constant effort no one saw because you performed it internally. That's the isolation of silent weight. It disconnects you from recognition. You began to feel unseen, not because people ignored you, but because they interacted with a role instead of a person. They responded to your reliability, not your reality. And you allowed it because correcting it felt disruptive. But carrying unacknowledged weight changes how you experience connection. Conversations feel heavier, expectations feel sharper. Even neutral interactions carry undertones of obligation. You weren't just listening anymore, you were managing outcomes. You weren't just supporting anymore, you were stabilizing environments at your own expense. And slowly, the cost became undeniable. The silence that once felt composed began to feel restrictive. The containment that once felt controlled began to feel limiting. The steadiness that once earned appreciation began to feel like a trap. This was not resentment, it was accumulation. The weight did not ask for attention, but it demanded acknowledgement. You reached a point where carrying it silently no longer preserved peace. It only delayed discomfort. And the delay had become too expensive. Something in you started to register that not all weight is meant to be held indefinitely, that some expectations survive only because someone absorbs them quietly, that pressure exists because it goes unchallenged. And for the first time, you did not rush to fix that realization. You let it sit. You let yourself feel the full measure of what had been accumulated, not dramatically, not urgently, but honestly. And that honesty marked a shift, not outwardly yet, but internally, the silence changed character. It no longer protected the status quo. It began to question it. Because carrying weight in silence teaches you one undeniable truth. Surviving isn't the same as being sustainable. It didn't arrive as defiance. There was no dramatic breaking point, no declaration, no irreversible act. What emerged was quieter than that, almost easy to miss. A pause where compliance used to be instant. A hesitation before agreeing. A moment of stillness where you once moved automatically. Something in you stopped flowing forward the way it always had. This was not rebellion. It was resistance without words. A subtle refusal that didn't announce itself, but altered your rhythm all the same. You didn't argue. You didn't push back. You simply slowed, and in that slowing, something became unmistakably clear. You were no longer willing to keep living the same way. The change didn't come from frustration. It came from recognition. Recognition that your adjustments were no longer temporary. That the effort you made to remain palatable had become structural, that you weren't pausing parts of yourself to get through a season, you were editing yourself out to maintain continuity. That realization didn't anger you, it steadied you. You began noticing how often your first instinct was to manage perception, to smooth responses, to calibrate tone, to anticipate reactions before expressing anything real. You saw it happening almost in real time, and for the first time, you didn't correct it automatically. You allowed the pause to exist. This resistance didn't fight expectations, it failed to respond to them. And that was the power. No explanation, no justification, just an absence of the reflex that once drove you. You weren't trying to be difficult. You were simply tired of being available by default. There were moments when people expected your usual response, and it didn't come. Not because you withheld it deliberately, but because it no longer formed naturally. The words felt distant, rehearsed, unnecessary. So you held your silence. And in that silence, you didn't feel anxious, you felt aligned. This was unfamiliar territory. You had been trained to associate hesitation with guilt, distance with danger, but this felt different. This quiet refusal didn't isolate you from yourself, it returned you to yourself. You began to sense how often your life had been structured around maintaining ease for others, how naturally you had edited your reactions to preserve smoothness, and how unnecessary that labor had become. The resistance showed up as discomfort, not outward but internal. Discomfort with explaining things that didn't require explanation. Discomfort with over-contextualizing your choices. Discomfort with maintaining harmony that depended entirely on your restraint. This discomfort didn't ask you to act. It asked you to notice. You noticed how certain situations now felt heavier than before, not because they changed, but because you no longer had the energy to carry them unquestioned. You noticed how certain dynamics relied on your compliance to remain stable. And you stopped stabilizing, not with anger, with absence. That absence unsettled people, not because you withdrew dramatically, but because you disrupted consistency. You stopped providing the cues others depended on. And without those cues, the structure wobbled. You didn't feel responsible for correcting it. For the first time, you allowed the wobble to exist. This is how quiet resistance works. It doesn't demand change. It stops reinforcing what no longer fits. It allows space where there was once insistence. You felt it when you no longer rushed to reassure, when you no longer softened truth before it left your mouth. When you stopped compensating for things that weren't yours to manage, and instead of loss, you felt relief. Small at first, almost shy. Relief that you no longer had to rush past your own reactions. Relief that you could let moments pass without filling them. Relief that your responses could remain incomplete without danger. You began to understand something fundamental. Your previous way of living was not chosen, it was maintained. Through effort, through repetition, through omission, and now that maintenance had stopped. Not abruptly, quietly. You didn't quit patterns, you outgrew their justification. There's a particular kind of resistance that doesn't create conflict, it withdraws permission. It stops agreeing to terms that were never formally accepted to begin with. This was that. You weren't rejecting people, you were rejecting roles. Roles that demanded emotional availability regardless of capacity. Roles that required explanation regardless of relevance. Roles that functioned only when you remained predictably responsive. And the moment you stepped outside that predictability, you felt something stabilize inside you. Not certainty, not confidence, but coherence. You felt less scattered, less split between what you felt and what you presented. The internal friction that once accompanied every interaction began to ease, not because situations improved, but because alignment returned. This quiet resistance didn't make you bolder. It made you simpler. You spoke when you meant it. You paused when you needed to. You let reactions exist without tidying them. And that simplicity felt different from detachment. It felt deliberate. You were not pulling away. You were refusing to overextend. There were moments when you wondered if this would be perceived as indifference. The thought crossed your mind, but it didn't stay long. Because indifference feels empty, this felt grounded. You weren't disengaging, you were recentering. And in that recentering, you discovered how much of your life had been shaped by motion you never questioned. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was irreversible. Once you stop responding automatically, you can't unsee the pattern. Once you allow yourself to pause, you can't go back to urgency. Once you feel the ease of not explaining, you can't justify excess explanation again. The resistance didn't ask for validation. It didn't demand acknowledgement. It simply remained, and by remaining, it changed everything. This was the beginning not of confrontation, but of authorship. The moment you stopped living inside default reactions and started choosing when to engage, quietly, firmly, without announcement, something in you had resisted, and you finally listened. Growth didn't arrive with applause. It didn't feel like achievement. It didn't come dressed as victory. It came as loss, not the dramatic kind people talk about, not heartbreak you can point to, but quiet subtractions that happened slowly enough to question whether they were real at all. The first thing you lost was familiarity. Not places, not people, but the comfort of knowing how things would go. The predictability of reactions, the ease of being understood without explanation because you had learned how to fit the role perfectly. Change disrupts that, not loudly, gently. Like rearranging furniture in the dark and discovering your body still reaches for what used to be there. You notice moments where conversations no longer flowed the same way, where laughter felt delayed, where shared references stopped landing, where the rhythm you once moved in together no longer matched. No conflict, no argument, just misalignment. And there's a particular loneliness in that kind of loss, because nothing went wrong. There's no story to tell, no clear fault to assign, just a sense that something familiar no longer fits the way it once did. You lost ease. You lost being instantly readable. People didn't adjust right away. Some didn't adjust at all. They reached for the version of you that no longer showed up automatically. They expected responses that came with explanation, effort, accommodation, and when those didn't come, confusion followed. Not always expressed, but felt. You noticed it in subtle ways. Longer pauses after you spoke. Different tones in response. Gentle jokes that hinted at distance. Comments about how you've changed. Those words didn't hurt at first. They echoed. They asked questions you didn't yet have answers for. You hadn't changed on purpose. You hadn't changed to prove anything. You hadn't changed to leave anyone behind. But something had shifted, and that shift created space. Space not everyone wanted to cross. You lost approval, not all of it, but the low-effort kind. The kind that came when you played a consistent role, when you were predictable. When you made things smoother for others, even at your own expense. When that stopped, approval became conditional, delayed, quiet. And that hurt more than you expected. Not because you needed it, but because you hadn't realized how much of your life had been arranged to maintain it. Approval had been a signal. You were doing it right. Growth interrupts that signal. It replaces it with uncertainty. People who once affirmed you easily now hesitated, not because they disliked you, but because they didn't know how to place you anymore. You weren't where they left you. That lack of placement created distance. And with distance came loss, not dramatic exits, not confrontations, but a gradual thinning of connection. Some relationships didn't survive that thinning, not because they were weak, but because they were structured around who you used to be. Around what you offered, how you responded, how reliably you made things easier. When those structures dissolved, the relationship had nothing else holding it together. And that is a particular kind of grief when nothing bad happened, but something ended anyway. You look back and wonder when it slipped, when conversations became shorter, when invitations slowed, when emotional closeness faded without explanation. This loss didn't feel fair. It felt confusing. You didn't choose distance, you chose alignment. But alignment doesn't always preserve connection. It reveals what the connection depended on. Some people stayed. Others drifted, not out of malice, out of incompatibility with who you were becoming. And that realization was heavy. Because parts of you wanted to reach back, not to return, but to reassure, to explain, to soften the gap, to restore familiarity. But that came at a cost you were no longer willing to pay. You also lost certainty. The certainty that came from knowing your role, from understanding expectations, from operating within recognizable boundaries. Growth removes that scaffolding. It invites you into a space without clear markers, where you are no longer guided by who you should be, but confronted with who you are. That space is quiet and uncomfortable. You no longer knew how you would be received. You no longer knew which version of yourself would be accepted. You no longer knew which connections would remain. That uncertainty felt like groundlessness. And yet beneath it, there was stability, not external, internal, because while you lost predictability, you gained congruence. You were no longer splitting yourself to maintain closeness. You were no longer editing reactions to preserve comfort. You were no longer playing the part that kept everything intact. And yes, things fell away because of that. But what remained felt solid. Growth is often framed as addition, as becoming more. But this kind of growth was subtraction, letting go of patterns that sustained connection at your expense, allowing friction where smoothness once cost you something, accepting that not all relationships survive honesty. What fell away wasn't random. It followed a logic you could only see in hindsight. Relationships that required you to remain smaller. Familiarities that depended on your silence. Approval that functioned only when you didn't disrupt expectations. Those things left when you stopped maintaining them, and that loss was real. You grieved routines you never questioned. People you didn't expect to drift. Versions of closeness that no longer felt accessible. But beneath the grief was something steadier. Relief. Relief that you no longer had to pretend continuity. Relief that your presence didn't depend on performance. Relief that your life no longer required constant adjustment to remain intact. Growth didn't take everything. It filtered. What remained may have been fewer, quieter, less immediately affirming, but it was real. Connections that didn't require explanation. Spaces where you weren't measured against who you used to be. Moments where you existed without translation. The loss hurt, but it didn't destabilize you. Because for the first time, what stayed wasn't dependent on who you became for others, but on who you were without effort. And that made the loss intelligible. Not romantic. Not heroic. Just honest. Growth doesn't preserve everything. It clarifies what was never meant to remain. Standing different rarely looks powerful from the outside. There are no announcements. No statements of intent. No explanations that make everything understandable. It looks quiet. And because it is quiet, people misunderstand it. They assume silence is avoidance. They assume distance is punishment. They assume restraint is weakness. They assume you owe clarification. But this stage of becoming asks something else of you. It asks you to stop translating yourself for those who are committed to misunderstanding you. At some point, you realize explaining was never about clarity. It was about safety. You explained to reduce tension, to soften reactions, to prevent disappointment, to keep yourself acceptable. Explanation became a habit before you recognized it as a choice. You explained why you felt the way you did, why you couldn't show up the same way, why you needed space, why you didn't respond right away, why something no longer fit. And every explanation carried the same hope. If they understand, they won't reject you. But understanding was never the issue. The issue was acceptance without negotiation. Over time, you noticed a pattern. The more you explained, the more permission others felt to question, reinterpret, and challenge your boundaries. Explanation invited debate. Debate delayed alignment. And alignment mattered more than being understood. Standing different meant choosing not to participate in that cycle anymore. You stopped clarifying decisions that were already clear to you. You stopped defending choices that cost you nothing to keep. You stopped responding immediately to demands for access, not out of anger, out of discernment. This wasn't about becoming distant for effect. It was about becoming still enough to hear yourself without interruption. Choosing restraint felt unfamiliar at first. You were used to filling silence, smoothing discomfort, offering words before tension solidified. Now, you let silence hold its shape, not the heavy, dramatic kind, but the steady kind, the type that communicates finality without needing volume. People noticed. They asked questions. They filled the silence for you. They interpreted your stillness however suited them. And you let them, not because you didn't care, but because you began to understand the cost of correcting every narrative. Some people don't need clarity. They need control. And when you stop supplying explanations, control loosens. Standing different is not reactive. It's grounded. You no longer rush to respond to messages that demand emotional labor. You don't revisit decisions to make them more comfortable for others. You don't soften truths that function better unaltered. Distance becomes a form of respect for yourself first. This is where alignment stops being internal and starts becoming visible. You don't post about boundaries. You don't announce growth. You don't justify changes. You simply act differently. And acting differently forces the world to adjust or fall away. At first, this feels exposed. Without explanation as armor, you are seen without clarification. People project motivations onto you. They assign reasons. They guess intentions. You resist correcting them not because they're accurate, but because their interpretation isn't your responsibility anymore. This is restraint. Restraint is choosing not to lower yourself into conversations that don't support your direction. Restraint is letting discomfort exist without resolving it on someone else's behalf. Restraint is recognizing that not every relationship survives your boundaries and not intervening to save it. Distance becomes less about withdrawal and more about orientation. You orient toward what aligns with who you are becoming, not what validates who you used to be. This isn't dramatic detachment, it's quiet consistency. You show up when it feels right. You disengage when it doesn't. You neither explain nor apologize for that calibration. Standing different also means releasing the need to be correct. You stop proving your intentions. You stop arguing timelines of change. You stop defending decisions that were made thoughtfully and privately. Not all understanding is earned through explanation. Some understanding only appears when people experience your absence. And if absence clarifies what presence obscured, that clarity was necessary. You are no longer interested in convincing anyone of your integrity. You don't rehearse justifications. You don't anticipate criticism. That energy returns to you. You notice the difference in your body first. Less tension before responding. Less mental rehearsal. Less emotional bracing. Standing different creates room. Room to choose your words instead of reacting. Room to select your company intentionally. Room to let life respond to you as you are, not as you manage yourself to appear. There is authority in that, not the visible kind, the internal kind. Authority that comes from coherence between what you think, say, and do. Authority that doesn't require endorsement. Authority that doesn't explain itself. You move slower. You decide quieter. You listen more closely to yourself. And because of that, everything else recedes. People who needed explanations struggle with this version of you. They sense the change but can't negotiate it. That discomfort is not cruelty, it's consequence. You are no longer available in the same way. Not because you shut down, but because you stand where you stand without apology. Standing different without explaining doesn't make you unreachable. It makes you clear. Clear about what you allow. Clear about what you invest in. Clear about what no longer requires conversation. You don't owe narratives. You don't owe reassurance. You don't owe performance. You owe coherence to yourself. And as this becomes practiced, not forced, you feel a quiet solidity. You're no longer waiting to be understood to proceed. You're no longer adjusting to be received well. You proceed because the direction is right. And that is enough. Standing different isn't loud, but it is unmistakable, especially to those who relied on your explanations to keep you close. Now, your presence stands on its own, without defense, without proving, without explanation, and that changes everything. Becoming who this change revealed does not feel like arrival. It feels like recognition. You don't wake up suddenly confident or complete or certain. You wake up quieter inside, less split, less divided between who you are and who you present. For a long time, change felt like loss because it removed what was familiar before it showed you what was true. It took away roles that gave you visibility. It loosened ties that made you feel necessary. It stripped patterns that once kept you safe. And without those things, you thought you had disappeared. But disappearance was only the surface feeling. What was actually happening was exposure. When obligations fell away, you saw how much of your life had been built around reaction. When approval stopped arriving, you noticed how little space you had left for yourself. When expectations loosened, your own shape began to appear underneath. This change did not add anything to you. It removed what was never yours. That is why it felt unsettling instead of empowering at first. You were not becoming someone new. You were returning to someone unedited. Becoming who this change revealed means living without the constant internal negotiation. You stop asking which version of yourself will be easiest to accept. You stop adjusting tone, timing, and truth to land softly. You stop scanning rooms for cues about how much of yourself is allowed. You begin to move from a steadier place, not certainty, not confidence. Alignment. Alignment sounds less dramatic than confidence, but it holds longer. Confidence can rise and fall with outcomes. Alignment stays because it is not dependent on response. You speak when you mean it. You withdraw when you need to. You decide without rehearsing, and slowly you realize something important. You are not harder to understand now. You are simply no longer explaining yourself into familiarity. Some people step closer in this phase. They recognize you without effort. They adjust naturally because nothing needs to be negotiated. Others drift. Not because of distance, but because the version of you they knew relied on your availability, your responsiveness, your compliance. The change clarifies relationships without accusing anyone. Becoming who this revealed version is also means accepting the quiet cost of integrity. You will not be as accessible. You will not be as predictable. You will not be as accommodating. And you will be more present than you have been in years. This presence is subtle. It doesn't announce itself, but it is felt. You feel it when you no longer overthink after conversations. When your body relaxes instead of bracing, when silence feels supportive instead of threatening. You feel it when you stop questioning whether you said too much or too little. When your days require less recovery. When your decisions no longer trail behind conversations. This version of you does not rush to define itself. It doesn't explain change to make it easier for others to digest. It simply lives. That is the difference. Becoming who this change revealed is not about closure, it is about continuity. You live forward, carrying less weight, fewer justifications, smaller explanations. And because you are lighter, you are steadier. Steadiness attracts what doesn't require effort to maintain. You stop trying to be seen correctly. You stop trying to be interpreted well. You stop trying to be enough. And in that release, you become exact, not improved, not elevated. Exact. This is where the story seals, not with resolution, but with orientation. You know where you stand now. You know what? You no longer trade for belonging. You know that explanation is optional, not required. And you understand that the change people noticed was not sudden. It was overdue. You did not become distant, you became precise. You were not losing people, you were losing roles. You stopped proving and discovered clarity waiting underneath. What remained when everything unnecessary fell away was you. This change did not erase you, it revealed you.